Warning, the following offer is for mature audiences only. Exciting, mysterious, intense, graphic, provocative, raw. This is no ordinary animation. This is the exotic, bizarre, and beautiful world of Japanese anime. And this is your invitation to enter with the modern classic Akira. Critics say Akira makes Blade Runner look like Disney World. It's action-packed, the future of animation. Siskel and Ebert call it the video pick of the week. Akira is yours for only $4.95 with subscription when you order the Best of Japanese Animation Collection Series. With these state-of-the-art sci-fi classics, you will enter a world beyond imagination, a future out of control, and an experience you will never forget. Don't say we didn't warn you.
Yeah, I've never seen Evangelion, but I know what it's about.
Yeah, I have seen it, and I have no idea what it's about.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby.
If it's not in frame, it doesn't exist.
I am big. It's the picture that got small.
What's that noise?
Popcorn.
You making popcorn?
Uh-huh.
I only eat popcorn at the movies.
Well, I'm getting ready to watch a video.
Really? What?
Oh, just some scary movie.
Like scary movies?
Uh-huh.
Really? Worst film you ever saw? Well, my next one will be better. Hello? Hello?
You want to see it again?
Can we?
And just like the movies, we play out our last.
You are listening to the History on Film podcast. And now here are your hosts, Ross Lennon and Ryan Barr.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the History on Film podcast. I'm joined by my close friend and colleague, Ryan Barr. How you doing, Ryan?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here.
So today we are talking about one of the most influential Japanese animated films, I think, of all time. I think that still holds up today. Talking about, of course, Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira. Ryan, this is a special film to us, both because we both liked it very much. It's also something that you and I have watched together quite a lot. We were discussing before we got started that this is in the Mount Rushmore of our hangout movies. What did we land on? So we have this. Yeah, we'll put that in the Jefferson spot.
Yes. Kill Bill. I feel like we watched part one a lot.
Mm-hmm.
We never really
Kill
did.
Bill 1,
Yep.
yes, much more than 2 for
Yeah.
whatever reason. But yeah, which also has an anime sequence.
True.
So we might loop around to that either at the end of this one or if we end up having to do a part 2. But yeah, so Kill Bill 1 is up there. And then Dazed and Confused.
A lot.
And then the last one, the Teddy Roosevelt, we landed on, I think, either Airplane or Caddyshack.
Yes.
Dealer's Choice.
Yeah, there was a lot of comedy movies. I distinctly remember Caddyshack more than Airplane for some reason, including one very eventful Caddyshack viewing where we actually did at a friend's house where we watched with him and his dad. And his dad is a minister. Well, he's retired now, but became a bishop, but he was a minister at the time. So that was very fun watching Caddyshack with a reverend, which sounds like a setup for a joke, but it's not.
So today's topic is anime, but more specifically the history of anime in the West. So we're going to go a little slowly right off the bat. Ryan, this is a topic that is not as simple as it seems. What is anime?
That's a very good question, and I think the answer depends on who you ask. To me, in general terms, anime is any animated content, whether that's movie, TV show, then you get into OVAs, music videos, anything that's animated and predominantly produced in Japan, although there is technically anime from other parts of the world now because of Japanese studios connecting like with Korean studios or French studios, South American studios. But traditionally speaking, anime is going to be your movies and TV shows that are animated from Japan. And I think the major distinction with anime versus maybe American animated films or even TV until very recently, that anime historically is not just for kids. Now there are TV shows, there are movies that are made just for kids. There's are those studios like Studio Ghibli that make for like family, all ages, and then there's also more mature, more content like that. And then there's also getting into actual adult productions as well, and the genres that it covers. It's not one genre.
I think that's a great way to put it. The only thing I would add to that is the book that I took a lot from is Jonathan Clements' Anime History. And he makes the distinction that anime is not a genre, it is a medium. And so I think that is a great way to approach it, is that you can have all these different kinds of stories, different kind of material, different formats, but there is this traditionally Japanese base structure that it's built upon. So why are we discussing Akira specifically? We'll get a little bit into it. We're going to do things a little bit differently tonight. We're not going to do a beginning to end approach to this film. Quite frankly, I don't know that it would help if you haven't seen the film already. But tell me just right off the bat what Akira means to you, and then I'll go next.
For me, Akira is one of those movies, and there's been a few in my life where you watch a movie and you've never seen anything like that before. Of course, as, young teen, first time I probably saw it I was maybe 13, 14. When I started watching with you, I was probably like 17, older high school, early college years. So I didn't understand like the technical side of it. But now as an adult and doing more history of it, it's kind of like it's up there with Star Wars and some other movies where the technology didn't exist. They had to invent technology and techniques and things like that, and that's what gives it that such a unique look. And this is going to be a sidebar to that. Compare Akira, the anime, to its manga. The manga is very distinct, but the movie, the way it moves, the fluidity, the way certain things in the backgrounds move and stuff. And again, they had to invent new lighting techniques, new painting techniques to it was hand drawn. This is the 80s. Even Disney wasn't using computer animation really at that point. So, we're looking at a very old art form here. So to me, that's what makes it so special, because it's so visually distinct and unique. And I don't understand that, but that kind of what makes you fall in love with it. And then, the story kind of just pulls you in. The story at the beginning, spoiler alert for a 40-year-old movie. I mean, the movie starts off with a giant explosion that kicks off World War III. Not too many, how many TV shows or movies or anything or books even that, start with like an explosion and then World War III happens, and then it skips 20 years and the movie's like, yeah, we don't care about World War III. It's now 2019. We're going to talk about it now. And I think was in the movie it's like 89 World War III starts. I think in the manga it's like 93. But most storytellers are like, hey, we're going to blow up Tokyo, and that's going to be the starting point of our story, and the whole story is going to be either this war or the survivors of this explosion or whatever. And Akira just says, yeah, we don't care about that. The whys and the reasons for this war that got started, who cares? That's not important. We're going to show you what happened after the war. And most people are like, wait, whoa, what are you doing? But I think that kind of pulls you in. That's the first 30 seconds you're pulled in. And then you start seeing the visuals and everything like that. And then there's a lot of the politics and the kind of the social, what's going on in society and everything in this world. It's very unique, very distinct. And it's a very much show, don't tell type of story. A lot of what is going on is from the background. It's what's, you see what's going on news reports and newspapers and background characters and extras in the background talk, overhearing bits and pieces of conversation about war and plagues and this and that and the economy. And, the story is not, it's important to the story, but it's kind of set dressing to the story that's being told. And I just found that fascinating as, a teenager who's just kind of learning about new and interesting and exciting stories, whether they're from Japan or obscure things from here in the West, or, even, by that time the Cold War is over. So we started getting access to like Soviet era movies and things like that. So, if you get into that at a certain age, and it kind of opens up this whole world. That's why Akira is very special to me.
And I think that's probably why this film became the vanguard for anime, sort of capital A anime in the West. As we're going to talk about, there's a long history of Japanese animation, both, in Japan and in the West. This is not at all the first anime to become popular in the United States, but it is the first Japanese anime to become popular as this very specific, sort of new medium of content. And I think, just like you said, the whole technical aspect of it, it's just such an incredible piece of art. And then the more you come to it with a critical eye, I'm not the kind of person to watch a ton of YouTube videos, but when you watch people doing like frame by frame analysis, and to think, like you said, that it's all hand drawn, the way that you see like shifting shadows and light patterns from a technological perspective, it is a masterpiece. I'm gonna do a very, very brief synopsis, just because I don't think we can quite get things started without it. But like you said, there's an atomic blast, World War III happens, and we fast forward 20 years into the future, and the film is spent following basically a teen biker gang. This is a juvenile delinquency movie fitting in with my body of work. And so you have these teenage delinquents living basically as sort of like orphans / almost refugees set amidst this political upheaval, social upheaval. The film is very critical of militarism, is very critical of the role of science and technology, the political structure in Japan at that time. It is a fascinating piece of work. It is, I don't want to say alien, it feels very of a world that was not readily accessible in the pre-internet age. And so I think that one of the reasons why so many people clasped onto this, it was based on a series of 6 Japanese comic books, what are called manga. The film actually came out before the books were done. So in a rich tradition of hoping that we stick the landing before the books come out, that has been followed by George R.R. Martin and several people since. So basically, the movie is the beginning of the first book, the end of the eventual 6th book. The writer and creator of the books was heavily involved in the film. That was a good move. And then the middle half of the film is basically 4.5, 5 books squished into one. So a lot of, sort of minor and background characters in the film have, long drawn out storylines in the books that you really only get a glimpse of. And I think, like you mentioned, Star Wars, one of the things about this is that you do feel like you're dropped into a world that already exists. You're not being handheld into this film. You kind of immersion there, like language immersion. You're just dropped into it and you kind of sink or swim.
I love that you mentioned like background characters that kind of you get a glimpse and you miss them cameo. I think a great example in Akira is the character of Lady Miyako, who's actually in the American dub is actually a male voice, which I always found interesting, but that's neither here nor there. But in the manga, she's a revolutionary leader and also kind of a religious leader as well. And I think in the anime there's like 2 scenes with her. There's one where she's like during a protest, and then one, like, again, spoiler, where like she dies. And so and I think that's what makes, I think, Akira the anime for someone like me who kind of grew up watching that anime. And then I didn't read the manga until I was in my 30s, and I finally read the manga cover to cover, and it's dense. It's a daunting read. It's one of you mentioned George R.R. Martin earlier. It's very much like reading A Song of Ice and Fire. You get done with one book and you got to take a break. You have to go have a palate cleanse and kind of process what you just did, and maybe read something a little more happy, something a little more cheerful, But so once you get that background with the manga, and then you go back and watch the anime, you're like, you become like the Leonardo DiCaprio meme, where you're just like pointing at the screen, and you're like, oh, that person has a bigger role to play. But that was also kind of the point of doing the animated version of the movie. Because the creator didn't know if he could finish the manga. So that was kind of his way of saying, hey, if I get the funding and I can get it all published, this is kind of where the story's going in a truncated way. And so, again, from, it's one of those things, like I said earlier, visually, storytelling wise, it grabs you in. But as I've gotten older and as I've learned more about the production behind it and the story behind it and the manga behind it and everything like that, you start appreciating it even more. You're like, wow, this, again, like Star Wars almost, like this shouldn't even exist. Like like so many things had to come together and line up perfectly for this to exist. It wasn't like some Hollywood production, or even, in Japan, it wasn't some production done by committee, done for the masses. It was definitely a labor of love. It was definitely something that, because the animators and the creator and the writers wanted this to happen, and I think that makes it even more, as someone in his late 30s now, it makes it even more charming, because now you're like, oh, sometimes these things just don't come out of the ether. It's 15-year struggle to get your piece of work in front of people and to let them enjoy it.
And I do wonder, and I don't know that there's a real answer to this available, but I know that for people of our age, in our mid to late 30s, people older than us and a little bit younger than us, this was the stepping stone, either from Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, Pokemon, into anime as a medium. Pre-internet, early internet, things were brought over on VHS a little bit. I mentioned that briefly in my talk with Dr. Wasser, another episode that is either out before or after this one. But, the way VHS sort of facilitated cultural exchange. But I don't know that this film has that same sort of guiding presence for people now just because anime is so popular. One of the reasons why I picked this is not just, I went down a list of movies I like. Really, we are in a world where anime is popular, is global. It has had a huge influence, somewhat ironically, as we'll talk about later, on a lot of American animation. Things like The Boondocks, Avatar: The Last Airbender. A lot of the stylistic and narrative hallmarks of anime appear now more and more in Western animation as well.
Well, you also see it in Western Hollywood production. I mean, one, blatant direct, whether they're an adaptation of an anime, for better or for worse, or something like The Matrix, but also even in stuff as Americana as like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There's influences from anime and influences from not just anime, but manga, and also a lot of Japanese tokatsu and kaiju films. I mean, you look at the MCU and you can point, well, there's influences of Godzilla and the Power Rangers and anime and manga and all these things. In fact, and I'll recommend this book later, but there's a book, Pure Invention by Matt Alt. And in that book, he talks about how Japan invented the modern world, and he goes through these different inventions, different cultural touchstones of Japanese culture that were exported out. And now, in Matt's view, and a lot of scholars' views, the whole world has turned Japanese. Japanese pop culture has kind of become lingua franca of global pop culture. You see it as French as the Paris opening ceremonies to the Olympics were. You could see some Japanese.
They were extremely French, yes.
As every article in The Guardian talked about, it was offensively French. But you also could see some influences of Japanese cultural influences. But that's also very French because the woodblock prints of the late Edo, early Meiji period of Hiroshige and Hokusai were a huge influence on Van Gogh and the other Impressionists. In fact, there's, I think, Debussy in one of his published sheet music. There's The Great Wave of Kanagawa on the cover. It's like, 1860, 1870 something. Not sure on the date. But so there's been a long history of Japan influencing France. And then, of course, France, there's a big love affair with Paris and France and Japanese culture too, which that's a whole other episode. But it's fun, when you start noticing, or you've studied these things, or you've worked in these areas, you can see these globalization connections that were there long before the internet and stuff like that. These connections, these influences, while it took longer, go back hundreds of years. A lot of times, this is not a new or a modern phenomenon. This has been going on continuously for many, many, many years.
So I want to start, going to kind of go back and forth between East and West. I've got a timeline of the development of anime and animation in the West and in the East. And we're going to see the sort of interconnectedness, Japan's animation industry, the United States animation industry, and we're going to kind of build off of that.
Sounds like fun.
Motion picture animation is invented in the late 1800s and early 1900s. In Japan, Katsuhiro Sashin is made around 1907 to 1912, and it is the first documented Japanese animation. It may actually predate the first American or Western animation appearing in Japan, so it would have been developed independently or simultaneously alongside a lot of Western animation techniques as well. There is a history of shadow puppetry and shadow theater in Asia, and so I think this was sort of a natural extension of that. Katsuhiro Sashin, which translates roughly to moving picture, then is a little boy who is writing the kanji for that on a board. He then turns and bows. It uses techniques similar to a magic lantern, where there's individual pictures and you spin a wheel And if you stare at one point of the wheel, you see the same image repeating over and over again as the wheel spins. So it could also be considered the first GIF. Back in the United States, the Fleischer brothers invented the rotoscope in 1914, and they patented it in 1917. They start making their cartoons in the 1920s. They're working for other companies, making their cartoons, but these companies are often facing financial setbacks. And so the Fleischer brothers, as we know them, don't come into the picture with Fleischer Studios until 1929. So right at the beginning of the Great Depression. At that point, they form a partnership with Paramount. The Fleischers, for those of you who don't know, are the creators of Betty Boop. They also did Popeye cartoons. Popeye was a newspaper cartoon. It was actually Olive Oyl, and Popeye was a side character who became so popular that he stole the show. But so they did those. They did Superman. We will have a Fleischer episode at some point. But the takeaway from this was that they had created the character Betty Boop. Betty Boop was extremely popular in the United States. She was also extremely popular in Japan. I did not realize this. Essentially what happened was the American animation was created, and it was cheaper for other countries to import American animation than it was to oftentimes develop their own animation studios. And that was what happened in Japan. There were some people creating their own animation, but to bring in the tools and the technology was prohibitively expensive when compared to we can buy these American film reels and just import them over, because at the time the studios were making so much domestically, they didn't see foreign markets as a realistic source of significant income the way we think about it now, where we look at a domestic box office and a foreign box office gross. So essentially what was happening is Japan and some other countries were getting animation from America cheaper than they could have done it on their own. And so their tastes and their techniques became very influenced by the animation that they were bringing in. Betty Boop was so popular in Japan that in 1935, she had an animation short where the character flies to Japan to perform for the audience. It was very tasteful for the 1930s. It was much more tasteful than the animation that would come in the 1940s with the American relationship to Japan. And the studio actually did bring in college students to work on the translation and the script writing for the film. So it was very respectful of the Japanese audience. It was directed primarily for the Japanese audience, and they loved it. Betty Boop's Language on My Own comes out in 1935. In 1937, Walt Disney releases Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which is the first animated feature film. It is a global phenomenon. It was seen through Europe, through Asia, obviously the United States. It sets the standard that an animated feature film can pull in an audience, can be something that people are willing to go see. Animation prior to that was primarily shorts. You would see a cartoon as well as a newsreel in addition to whatever feature film you were going to see. Snow White set the standard that you could have an animated film. Obviously, that, Snow White, I have to assume pretty much everybody has seen it. It looks great. Just, it's a classic.
Or we have to do a spoiler alert for a almost 100-year-old movie.
A 100-year-old movie based on I assume, several hundreds-year-old fairy tale.
Yeah, I mean, I know the Grimm brothers are given credit for writing that down, but I'm pretty sure that was floating around Germany and Central Europe probably before that. Spoiler alert for those who don't know, Snow White, her stepmom wants to kill her, and as usually in most of these fairy tales and Disney movies, usually one parrot's dead and the other parrot has bloodlust for whatever reason, and then hilarity ensues. She meets some dwarves. They're miners. There's at one point she eats an apple. She falls asleep. It's a whole thing. If you haven't seen it, check it out.
So Japan is importing most of their animation up through the 1930s. And then at the beginning of World War II, for very obvious reasons, they stop bringing in American cultural products. And the government looks to find ways to create their own animation studios, their own everything. And so one of the things that they do, as we see in the United States, as we see in Europe, is they create animated films to advance wartime propaganda. This is certainly something that we did as well, as I mentioned.
The Fuhrer has selected you for overtime.
Japan doesn't produce as many animated propaganda films. I think part of it was just because they had to get so much of the infrastructure up and running, and by the time they did that, the war was almost over. But Mitsuyo Seo creates a film called Momotaro, Sacred Sailors in 1944. He creates it under orders from the Navy. And even as he's creating this film for a Japanese audience at the height of the war, the Navy is telling him, hey, we want you to kind of go with what Disney did in Fantasia, which was released in 1941. And so even at the height of the war, they're telling him, make something as good as like what Disney makes.
No pressure.
Betty Bloop, the Fleischers, Snow White, Fantasia, Disney, these are not the only influences for the Japanese artists. Obviously, they have a rich tradition of their own to draw from, but these are sort of the trends that these creators are swimming in prior to the 1950s and 60s. The war ends in Japan after the atomic bombs are dropped, and Japan is occupied by the US military. Animation imports begin again, and the Japanese government creates new anti-censorship laws in response to sort of the oppressive climate set during the war. There was heavy censorship during the war itself, and so as sort of a response, and we see this in other places as well, they really sort of loosen up on a lot of content censorship. There are some regulations in terms of nudity and stuff like that. So in the 1950s, the television is taking off as the new cultural platform. This is something that I talk about a lot in my other work. We've mentioned it, I believe, in a couple other episodes at this point as well. But Americans are watching TV. The number of televisions skyrockets in American homes between 1948 and 1950. And then from 1950 to 1960, it's a huge increase. The 1950s is the decade of television. And so animation begins to transmit, as I said, a lot of animation was seen as like shorts. So if you think of like a Bugs Bunny cartoon or any like the Betty Boop cartoons, these are all short films. And as Disney's popularity grows, animation is seen in the United States as something exclusively for children.
Right.
Outside of the feature films, which again are directed at all ages, animation in the United States is seen as something for kids, almost exclusively. And so it finds its home in television as being a kids-only product. Japan's first animated feature film in 1958 is The White Snake Enchantress. And that is by a studio named Toei, and their goal is explicitly to become the Disney of the East. Osamu Tezuka a moderately successful manga artist, works briefly for Toei on a film called Alakazam the Great. He hates working for them and decides to break off and form his own studio, Mushi Productions. And so here is where we get into sort of the big three that we're going to talk about in the history of anime.
There you go, Astro Boy, on your flight into space, rocking on through the stars, for adventures soon you will make. Astro Boy bombs away on your mission today. Here's the countdown and the blast of everything is go, Astro Boy.
So historian Sugata Nobuyuki identifies three key points in anime history. And that begins with Astro Boy and its influence, and that is in 1963. Osamu Tezuka creates Astro Boy and is able to sell foreign rights to NBC, the American NBC, which gives him enough capital to make 52 episodes. NBC, like we said, is looking for content to fill their network, sort of the kids' TV hours. And so they approach Tezuka, and he has 4 episodes completed, and he's struggling to find the money for more. NBC says, we'll give you the money to make 52 episodes. And they have some restrictions at the time. Obviously, we're, 18 years from the end of World War II. Mm-hmm. So they want it to be placeless, is the word, I believe, that is used in describing it. So although it has a uniquely Japanese style that we recognize now, and Astro Boy was created in Japanese, content-wise, NBC wanted to make sure that it's a futuristic series, and they wanted it to exist very independent of, Japanese culture and American culture. The story of Astro Boy, to talk about Disney influence, is about a father who is an inventor who loses his young son and creates an artificial son to replace him. It is essentially the story of Pinocchio, except Pinocchio is a robot with rocket boots and, quite frankly, is much cooler than Pinocchio.
Also, I believe he has an atomic reactor as his technically as his heart. He's an atom heart. Pinocchio could never.
Yeah, Pinocchio joins the circus. Like, Astro Boy is fighting people, doing cool stuff.
He's fighting bigger evil robots.
And so Astro Boy sort of is this first wave of what we think of as anime. Tezuka, his art style is heavily influenced by Betty Boop and a lot of the Disney products. He is the one who, taking the lead from Betty Boop, gives his characters large, round eyes, which has become, a staple of anime because it's very easy to be expressive with large, round shapes. And so while anime has a lot of diversity in style, a lot of people were influenced by Tezuka. And so not to get too into sort of great man history, but Tezuka really does set a lot of work that people aspire towards. And so a lot of his choices have generational impact. But Tezuka is able to get the money from NBC to create 52 episodes. He also creates several other series that we'll talk about in a minute, but he makes the 52 episodes and he gives them to NBC thinking, all right, great. If they like these, they're going to give me more money. Astro Boy is a hit in Japan, is a hit in the United States. But NBC says, well, we have these 52 episodes. We're just going to run them forever. So Astro Boy will be remade several times throughout history, but it has that 52 episode run, and NBC is like, we're good. We don't need any more. The story is not very heavily serialized, meaning you can kind of watch episodes, in any particular order. Tezuka also created Kemba the White Lion, which is a story. All right, so this is crazy. All right, so Kemba is influenced by Bambi. And so Kemba is the story of a lion cub who, after watching the death of their parent, has to choose to become the leader of the pack that everybody wants them to become. So Kemba is influenced by Bambi, and the Lion King is influenced by Kemba the White Lion.
What's the most resilient parasite? An idea.
Didn't Disney get sued over The Lion King and Kimba the White Lion? I know there was some controversy there.
I remember reading about it, but yeah, so it is this very sort of like interesting case of Kemba was very heavily influenced by Bambi, which was hugely popular. And then Kemba was so influential to people who would go on to become animators. Like the people who become animators are familiar with Kemba and are familiar with Tezuka. And so The Lion King is, I mean, of course, it's also Macbeth, but it's also Kemba the White Lion.
It's also Macbeth. Yeah, that's actually one of my favorites. When people ask me, like, "What's your favorite Shakespeare adaptation?" I'm like, The Lion King, and people are like, "What?" I'm like, "It's Macbeth."
He also creates a popular series called Princess Knight. Princess Scarlet of Princess Knight is essentially Snow White plus Betty Boop plus a sword. It's a very influential series, although it does not immediately make the transition to the United States that Astro Boy does. It would come over in the 1970s. But with Astro Boy in 1963, the first wave of anime to hit the United States is Astro Boy, Kemba the White Lion, and Gigantor.
You gotta do it in the voice.
Excuse me, Gigantor. Yeah, you gotta sell it. Yeah, Gigantor.
Which also, Gigantor is kind of credited as like the first mecha anime as well.
I didn't want to pass by on Gigantor without mentioning that one of the common genres of anime is what's called the mecha anime, and that is a person, typically a young boy, in charge of a giant fighting robot that will either fight other robots or some various kind of monster.
And sometimes monsters and robots. And
sometimes monsters and robots.
Robot monsters, depending on. I feel like that's a whole other episode to get into Mecha and Gundam and my favorite, the Big O. There's that's a whole other episode.
So Astro Boy, Kemba, and Gigantor come to the US dubbed and in black and white, with very little acknowledgement that they're Japanese products at all. I mean, to the extent that they can, NBC really tries to keep Japanese away from people's, understanding of these shows. They're popular, but because they're in black and white, as more and more TV sets and broadcasts become oriented towards color, the shows sort of lose their popularity. Obviously, because there's only the 52 episodes of Astro Boy, once people have seen them all, they kind of move on. So even though Astro Boy has a long legacy in Japan, it's kind of this flash in the pan in the United States. Maybe some people realize, this is an import, but just as likely people are not aware of it because we were at war with Japan not that long in the past. In between,
and by 63, I mean the occupation had only been over a couple of years. It was still some moons were still fresh, I think, for both sides of the Pacific.
Towards the end of the 1960s, we do get a color anime in the United States that's very popular. That is Speed Racer. Speed Racer is popular. It suffered more than Astro Boy and Kemba and Gigantor because the way these first waves of anime were created, they were created obviously in Japanese first, and so the mouth movements of the characters reflected the Japanese speaking patterns. And so much as you might have seen in a Godzilla movie, these foreign products that were brought in and dubbed, what we call dubbing, which is where English voice actors read lines over top of film that is shot in another language. The dubbing really was bad.
It was. I think careless would be a great way to describe it. It was just done.
Yeah, there was a lot of concern of just trying to sort of make the mouth movements line up sort of as best as they could. There was no sort of attempt to finesse the animation or redo any of the animation. These imports were meant to be done as cheaply as possible. And so in Speed Racer, really more than anything else, you do get this phenomenon of the lines being read very fast. It's humorous now to go back and watch it, but it's this very unnatural speaking style, and it did give this very surrealist quality to it. There was also some cuts for content, some cuts for violence, but really you had this very stilted and strange speaking patterns on top of this animation.
But couldn't you argue that also that's what kind of added to the charm of Speed Racer and kind of made it unique? I mean, Speed Racer, even if people have not seen Speed Racer, either the original anime or even the live action movie, which is, in my opinion, an underrated masterpiece. But don't take my word for it. My favorite Godzilla movie is Godzilla Final Wars. So, I'm not going for high art here. I just like a good time. But also that speaking style you spoke of, because of the technological limitations and trying to dub them for cheap, has been parodied and referenced, not just in the United States, but in Japan, in Europe, in South America. It kind of became also not only a kind of a love letter to the Speed Racer, but also a bit of a, if you know, and if you get it, you get it. And like, these are animators and creators making art that they were influenced by this, and they're going to make it. Dexter's Lab, of all things, has a Speed Racer parody episode, which people, I don't even know how many people, with the age cutoff for Dexter's Lab familiarity is, but people of a certain age might not have never seen Speed Racer, but they know that speaking style and they understand that those cadences, everything, because they saw a Dexter's Lab episode one afternoon on, TV.
It's sort of like how everyone our age saw Sunset Boulevard because we watched Tiny Toon Adventures.
Right. Or everyone saw, or even the Tiny Toon Adventures episode where they're referencing Apocalypse Now,
yes.
where they're on the golf cart and it's like, this is the middle of our story. Like, what 9-year-old in 1995, 1996 is going to get that reference? But as an adult, or even you get to high school, college, you finally see Apocalypse Now because you got the one movie buff friend that's like, we all got to watch the Apocalypse Now this weekend. And then you watch, you're like, oh, I get what I was referencing now, like 10 years later.
Calling the Mach 5. Come in, Speed. Trixie calling the Mach 5.
I'm in the middle of a race, Trixie. Don't talk to me now. Can't you wait till it's over?
Speed, listen to me. Eloise's brother Hap has got to win. Please let him.
Why should I let him win? I'm out to win myself. Now sign off and don't bother me.
But Hap must win so that he can pay for the doctors to make his sister well. And besides, Hap would then be hired to manage a big car factory. That would solve all their money problems. Please let him win, Speed.
It doesn't matter to me what his reasons are for wanting to win. I wouldn't be playing fair if I let him win the race on purpose.
But Speed!
I'll see you when the race is over, Trixie.
But Eloise is ill. They must have some money. Please let him win, Speed. Speed! Speed! Speed!
Speed wins!
So by the end of the 1960s, animation in the United States is seen as something entirely for children. And then there is this adoption of animation by the counterculture beginning in the 1970s, spearheaded by Ralph Bakshi, who is an American animator. He created some very influential, very powerful, very politically oriented films in the 1970s. And following the death of Disney in 1966, Disney kind of goes into a fallow period until the Disney Renaissance that starts in the end of the 1980s. So there is not this powerhouse of American animation, and just the medium is sort of withering on the vine. And so the counterculture adopts it to sort of create these not remotely for children films to advance their messages, and just adopting this form to promote their beliefs. Like, So Ralph Bakshi sort of represents spread of the counterculture into the realm of animation. His film Fritz the Cat in 1972 is the first X-rated animated feature film. And then this brings us to the second of Sugata Nobuyuki's 3 points on anime history, and that is with the creation of Space Battleship Yamato. So, are you familiar with this show?
I am. I am actually. I've never seen like all of the episodes. I feel it's like one of those anime series like you catch it, it's on. I think people, especially in our age, like mid to late 30s, early 40s even, it's more known by reputation. No one sit down and binge watch the entire series the way they've maybe done like Cowboy Bebop or something like that. But they've seen an episode or two and they kind of understand and know what it's about. And yeah, I'm familiar with that.
So I'll give a brief summation of the series, and then maybe you can help me with this other part. So
Okay.
in the series, which to point out predates both Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica, so the world is being attacked by aliens from outer space, and Earth's only hope of survival is to retrofit an old battleship, turn it into a spaceship, sail to another planet, find the cure to what they're being attacked with, and make it back to Earth within a year. The ship that is retrofitted is the Japanese battleship Yamato. What can you tell us about the significance of the word Yamato and the ship itself?
Oh, well, there's a lot of history there, obviously, because I know the Americans sank it. And I think it was actually used during one of the Marshall Island atomic tests
Yes.
too. All right. So yeah, I know the Yamato was a Japanese battleship used during World War II. It was eventually converted into an aircraft carrier, and the Americans sank it. And not only did we sink it, it was captured, and then later on in the 50s, during the atomic testings in the Marshall Islands, it was one of the captured ships that was used during, I want to say, Operation. I just read this. I'm reading Annie Jacobson's book on the history of Area 51, and I just read this chapter, so I should know. I want to say it was 1948, the Bikini Atoll bombing, but yes, it was used. It was used as kind of a guinea pig on seeing what American nuclear weapons can be done, what effect nuclear weapons would have on ships if there was a naval battle or using nuclear weapons. So there's a lot of history there.
Well, and so what does Yamato mean?
That's a great question. I know it's one of the older names for Japan. I can just because and it's more the Okinawan, I think, version.
So it's Imperial Japan. Like it is the name for like the first Japanese dynasty. So the battleship Yamato, the real one, was one of the main ships of the Imperial Japanese naval fleet during World War II. They did not have this production scale that the United States had in terms of putting out ships. And so what they did is they ramped up the development of these two major ships, the biggest one being Yamato. And so the Yamato is the flagship of the Imperial Japanese fleet. And Yamato is sort of a early name for Japan. It represents the first Japanese dynasty, 1300 years earlier, something like that. And so there is a huge sense of Japanese national pride tied to the original ship, and then that is imbued in the series in the 1970s. So the idea that this relic of imperial glory would be retrofitted into a spaceship would represent both the past and the future, and the salvation for the entire world is obviously a very charged political statement.
To put it mildly.
Yeah. And so not to no one's surprise, the name of the ship was changed in the American version that was released later. They say, yes, this is the Yamato, but we're renaming it the Argo. But so this series, it does have it has some more adult or maybe all ages content. Characters drink, characters die and don't come back. The show is heavily serialized. And so those are sort of advancements in, sort of the approach. Those are changes to the methodology of television making and anime making. And Space Battleship Yamato is hugely popular still to this day in Japan. The TV series at first was not tremendously successful. A couple of years after its release, they created a film version that recapped the first season of the show, and that was a huge success. And that gave birth to what we call the OVA, or original video animation. In the United States, we often think of direct-to-video as being, quite rightfully, something that's cheap, has lower production values, and is almost a cash grab to a more successful feature film that would have had a theatrical run. In Japan, they saw these OVAs as an alternative pipeline to producing content. And so, whereas you may have a TV series that receives some OVAs as well, you might also have a series that only exists as run of multiple OVAs. And the approach was, well, we can make a series of a show, or we can use most of that money and make a high quality film. This is also the time that the VCR is becoming available in Japan. And so the idea of having access to films at home, being able to rent them, it presented a new way of engaging with this material, distributing it. And so the OVA becomes sort of a new means of distribution. And Space Battleship Yamato is the one that gets that started because the recap film was so incredibly popular. We do get, as I mentioned, a version in the United States. It is heavily what we call boulderized. So meaning that a lot of content was just sort of find and replaced from the version that was brought over here. So characters who might drink alcohol in the Japanese version are said to be drinking spring water. In the American version, characters who are drunk are just feeling very silly or extra spirited. And so a lot of the content is changed or removed because they see this as something that is coming in, again, exclusively for children, although this was a show that was very much geared towards an all ages with a lot for older viewers as well.
I want to add an aside to that. What you said when you're naming off the localization, I'd be like, onigiri was called jelly donuts.
Yeah, rice balls, which do not taste like jelly donuts.
Yeah, no, don't even look like jelly donuts.
This is something that continues for decades in the localization of Japanese anime to the United States. I think one of the most infamous examples for people of our generation, the series Sailor Moon has two female characters involved in a romantic relationship. In the Japanese version, it's two female characters in a romantic relationship. In the first American dubbed version, while they knew that they did not want to include that, they only took out sort of the most obvious textual implications of that relationship while seemingly ignoring most of the subtext of that relationship and labeled the two characters as cousins. And so people who were actually watching, it wasn't that the relationship was scrubbed entirely, it was that it was scrubbed in the most lazy way possible. And you could argue made it much worse by having these two characters be depicted as cousins who are also in love.
George Michael was getting ready for school when he came across a box of love letters he'd written but never sent to his cousin Maybe. One letter, titled, "If You Weren't My Cousin," was particularly incriminating.
I think when those episodes finally started coming out, I was like in 8th grade. So I was well aware of what was going on. And even in 8th grade, you're watching it, 12, 13 going, they're not cousins. And why would it? And then you also ask yourself, why did they make that decision? Like, obviously they're girlfriends and that's okay. Why are we dancing around it and making it like you said, it makes it even more problematic?
I think you just have to remember like the outrage to the puppy episode on Ellen, and just the extremely irrational approach that people had towards the most tepid of depictions of homosexual relationships at that time. So that's the second wave, is the introduction of the OVA and the more, the broader thematic material of Space Battleship Yamato. The third and final stage Nobuyuki identifies is Neon Genesis Evangelion and its influences, and that begins in 1995. So in this sense, Neon Genesis Evangelion, I would describe it maybe as a postmodern anime. It takes a lot of the tropes, a lot of the genre conventions that we've discussed a little bit, and really sort of deconstructs and inverts them. We had talked about Gigantor in the 1960s.
You mean Gigantor?
We had talked about Gigantor in the 1960s as being the loving, sort of the very charming, wholesome story of a little boy in charge of a gigantic robot. Evangelion basically takes that story and makes it as terrifying as humanly possible. It is hypercritical of the political situation in Japan, is hypercritical of militarism, and I don't want to get too much deeper into it. Needless to say, it is a deconstruction of every genre convention and norm of anime at that time. So it does represent a huge stylistic shift. It's a one-season series with several OVAs being made from the mid-90s until very recently. I think the last one was in 2022. It's either right at the beginning of COVID or maybe a year after. So within the last 5 years, there's been another one. But the technological aspect to it was that the series was funded through something called a production committee. And this is something that actually happened with the Space Battleship Yamato movie that we had discussed, where instead of getting all of the funding either from a studio or upfront from a network, the rights to the series, the funding was pooled from a variety of investors, essentially, primarily people that were going to be merchandising the series. And so while this was something that you do see happening with films, this was the first time that a TV series had done it. Or specifically an anime series had done it. And so because the show was a success, it showed that this means of funding was possible, which really in the long term has led to sort of an underfunding and created a very difficult working environment for animators. And it really rewards creating series that can be merchandised and heavily marketed in terms of having consumptive habits connected to the show itself. So you really see, although the show itself is very successful, it's very intelligent, it is made possible through this funding system that has only become much more prevalent since.
Maybe I could love myself. Maybe my life could have a greater value. That's right. I am no more or less than myself. I am me. I want to be myself. I want to continue existing in this world. My life is worth living here.
Now, of course, there is a giant yellow mouse in the room that we have to discuss. I don't think we have. I think this is where we're going to pick up perhaps part 2 of this series. But it is worth mentioning that in 1996, Pokemon becomes a worldwide phenomenon that is still obviously wildly successful to this day.
I was there. I remember.
If for some reason this series does not take off, we will very easily transition into a Pokemon-based podcast series. I am very confident of that.
That is something I have to do no research. I could just vamp for. Give me 2 hours on the microphone. I will vamp for 2 hours on Pokemon, what Pokemon means to me, the influence of Pokemon to the greater global community. I could do this all day.
Catch 'em, gotta catch 'em all. Gotta catch 'em all. Pokemon!
So Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira comes out in 1988. As we talked about a little bit, it is a war movie. It is a science fiction horror movie. It is a juvenile delinquency movie. It defies definition. The Matrix, which is the next episode that we're going to be recording, the Wachowski sisters were hugely influenced by Akira. There is an iconic scene at the beginning of the film where one of the characters does a joust with a rival gang member and slides their motorcycle in a very stylistic way. And you can find compilation videos. It is perhaps one of the most iconic images in animation of the last 40 years, at least.
And it's referenced in animation, it's referenced in video games, it's referenced in live action. I have seen even the most I don't want to say obscure, because something like Paw Patrol isn't obscure, but like you'll even see references to Akira in something as benign and for children like Paw Patrol and things like that's what's so fascinating to me about Akira, is that much like Tetsuo, with his body morphing, and this is going to sound really weird out of context if whoever hasn't seen it, but as his body is morphing and growing, and tentacles and pipes and cords and wires are coming out of him, much like that happening to the character in Akira. It's also that Akira, the anime itself, has done that to as its influence has grown, not just in Japan, not just in the United States, but you see it, everywhere. I mean, there's probably some untouched tribe in the middle of the Amazon that also will get an Akira reference for whatever reason. That's the kind of impact that this movie has had.
In the Lascaux cave paintings, there's a hunter-gatherer atop a bison doing a cool sideways move. It's sort of like the Velvet Underground. They say, oh, not everybody bought that Velvet Underground record, but everyone who did started a band. Not everyone saw Akira in 1988, but everyone who did went and worked for an animation studio.
Right. Yeah. It's just, the influence, like I said, I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, yeah, especially anime referencing Akira, because you're like, okay, of course, like it's, something that's very, it's in the Japanese popular culture, popular imagination now. I don't know if there's a word for Japaneseness the way we have for like Americana, with like the way like, things become part of the American lexicon, pop culture. But Akira sits in that pantheon for the Japanese. So that makes sense. It also makes sense for Americans. But when you see like a children's show from France, like referencing Akira, you're like, wait, what is going on here? Because yeah, everyone that saw that probably went on, if they went on into working in the arts and in media, it's like, well, I got to reference Akira. I mean, one of my favorite kind of esoteric Akira references, there's a Kanye West music video, which like shot for shot, scene for scene reenacts scenes from Akira. I mean, again, if you haven't seen Akira, you've seen Akira. Like if you've seen like Kanye West music video, or all these other sources that reference it.
Yeah, Kanye West was sort of one of the first celebrities to really sort of tell everyone, hey, go watch Akira. I know The Weeknd, it's been an influence to him as well. So it is something that you see a lot of creators in popular culture. It really is an influence point for a lot of people that you may not expect otherwise.
And again, not to belabor, it's just come for the visuals. Like just like come with an open mind for the visuals. The story might take you a couple times, like the grab. It's definitely one of those type of movies where like you pick up on the plot the second watch through, but just come and let the visuals take you on a journey. Just because the visuals are wild. I mean, there's, like I said, there's body horror in it. There's a scene, one of the main characters, which, by the way, none of the main characters are named Akira. That's a whole other thing to get into. But one of the main characters is being tormented, for lack of a better word, by these psychic other. Oh yeah, because people are psychic in this world. By the way, their psychic characters are being tormented by psychic, like the other psychic characters. That this character has latent psychic abilities, as I find out, and they torment him by using toys in a nursery, in a children's playroom, a nursery, come to life and become horrifying. Like, did you ever think teddy bears can be scary? Because there's a scary teddy bear in Akira. Like, like, just again, out of context, someone who's listened to this who's never seen this movie is going to think, what are they talking about? And you just kind of have to see it to believe it.
And I think one of the things that makes this film such an interesting teaching tool, because one of the things, we like to approach this with from the history on film angle is like, well, what can this tell us about the people that made it? And really, it's the idea, and I'm certainly not the first person to say this, but like you said, the film opens with an atomic blast, an image that to people who had lived still, they're still survivors of World War II when this film is coming out. Certainly there are children of people, who had lived during World War II. Like, that is a very different image in Japan than it is in the United States. We sort of have this technological triumphalism in the United States, the idea that as technology develops, so too will we progress and prosper. Japan really has to reckon with that in the wake of the 2 atomic blasts. And so this film it presents that very real conflict through science fiction. Which is one of the things that science fiction does very well. It sort of reflects the potential for repression in response to tragedy, in response to these sort of catastrophes. And obviously there's the science fiction angle, there is the psychic supernatural angle. Maybe this would help people. Akira was a huge influence in Stranger Things, which takes place in the 1980s.
And also there's influence, because they were congruent, and don't remember the actual. Hold on, what year did Blade Runner come out?
82.
I know,
yeah.
Akira was. So even though they're contemporaries and they were kind of in production at the same time, you could see where Blade Runner and Akira were bouncing off each other and kind of depicting. And actually, they're both taking place in the same year, which is neither here nor there. But it all, in a lot of ways, they both can exist in the same universe because of, the way architecture and buildings are presented in these 2 stories. I mean, Blade Runner, is credited for kind of starting the whole genre of cyberpunk, but I would say that, Akira fits in that. I think there's kind of big 3. There's 3 heads that dog that influenced that cyberpunk. I think Blade Runner, Akira, and then, Necromancer, William Gibson, I think are the kind of, each one has independently been pointed to like, oh, they started that genre of cyberpunk, but I think all 3 kind of all existing at around the same time. They all came out within the same decade. They all kind of bounced off of and built upon the last one that came before it to make this genre that now you can go and point to it now and saying, oh, that's cyberpunk. But in the 80s, that wasn't, these 3 kind of had to be the protogenitor and kind of had to birth that into existence.
And I think one thing that's important to mention here, surprised we haven't mentioned it already, Japan in the 1980s experiences an economic boom that it has not seen since. Essentially, from the beginning of the 1980s to the end of the 1980s, they have the highest economic prosperity that they have not experienced even close to since. And so that certainly made it possible for a lot of these OVAs to be produced. The golden age of the Japanese economy is not coincidentally also considered to be the golden age of anime in Japan. Akira is one of many great titles that comes out in this period, but Akira was also very critical of the underlying structure that created that economy. And of course, by the time Akira becomes a success, that economy is already beginning to crumble.
Right. They call it the bubble economy because it was basically a bubble that burst 91. And what I find fascinating about Akira being critical of that late Showa period and the bubble economy of the 80s, which also gave us, a city pop and a lot of very uniquely late Showa era Japanese cultural icons, I guess you can, for lack of a better word. Akira is also kind of timeless, whereas other animes that came out in the 80s, whether they were set contemporarily or set in some other time period, are still very dated. Were even possibly dated when they came by the time they came out. And that's, of course, because animation also has such a long production time. That makes sense from a technical standpoint. But you go and watch Akira today in 2024. It could have been made earlier this year, and a lot of the things that's critical of are still things that are going on both in Japanese society and American society. The fear of military industrial complex running rampant and unchecked. To quote Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park, one of the themes in Akira is, the scientists are so preoccupied if they could, they don't never stop to think if they should. That is still something that we're still dealing with now with AI. Before it was CRISPR and gene technology. Before that, we go back to the 30s and 40s, there's atomic energy. These kind of questions of just because science can, should science, should make sense. And so, Akira is still, it's both it's timeless in that sort of sense, and very few movies or in animation, whether it's animation, live action, whatever, kind of have that timelessness to it and kind of have that it's still relevant now. It might actually even be more relevant in 2024 than it was in the 1980s when it came out. And I think that what makes it so endearing and long lasting and charming and influential, because you can watch it through, let's say we're watching it in the 90s. You can watch it through a very 90s lens and see it as a 90s, and then you can watch it in the 2020s now and see it through a 2020s lens, to the point where this hasn't come up yet, but one of the backgrounds of Akira is taking place in 2019, and Tokyo has been selected to host the 2020 Olympics in that movie, and it's not going it's not going well for different reasons. They're delayed with the construction of the Olympic Stadium, and of course the big final set piece is the Olympic Stadium, which is awesome. Again, out of context, people are like, what are they talking about? A fever dream? What are they talking about? But there's a graffiti on one of the signs to when the construction sites for the Olympics said, just cancel it, which became very much a sentiment in Japan in 2020, with the Tokyo Olympics having to be put on hold. And, Tokyo finally gets their Olympics in 2021. It wasn't the grand celebration. It wasn't the big reemergence to the global stage Japan wanted. It was the only Olympics you watch, and there's nobody in the stands, no spectators. The opening ceremonies was a completely different version than what they originally had planned because of the pandemic. And while even in the movie of Akira, I think it's mentioned maybe once, in the manga, there is a talks about a pandemic in the background going on that's laying waste to China and other parts of the world. So it's almost like, people talk about how The Simpsons predicted the future. Well, in a lot of ways, Akira predicted the future. It just, luckily it didn't predict World War III. But there's all these other things going on in Akira that's either happened or could happen. Again, it makes it timeless. Again, you can watch it in 2024 and still see, there's warnings for the future, and it's a 30-year-old film. And I think that's poignant, and I think that makes it profound and prophetic. But yeah, I keep saying it, but if you haven't seen it, people need to go and see it, because it's just and all those references we've talked about, like, you'll pick up on, like, if you've been on the internet from any time from like 1999 till now, you're going to see references. You're going to see, that's where that comes from. It's the same. I had the same reaction because I saw the Austin Powers movies first before I saw kind of the back catalog of some of the older from the 60s and 70s
in like
James Bond movies.
Yeah.
And like Flint and some of the parodies, the Casino Royale, which is a great,
the first one,
the original Casino Royale. Yeah, the parody. So if you watch Austin Powers and you go back and watch those, you're like, that's where he got that from. It's not random. It's not obscure. If you know, if you get the reference, you get the reference. And I think Akira is kind of like that, where if you've been on the internet and you've been watching TV or movies for the last 20, 30 years, you've seen Akira referenced repeatedly. And now you can go back and kind of see the source material of it.
Yeah, and I think there's just so much depth to the critiques that it puts forward. Obviously, it's, this very conflicted view of technology. Also, this view of militarism and police violence. Japan has not had a military since the end of World War II, but you do see overwhelming use of police force. You see a lot of human experimentation, like you were talking about, sort of pushing beyond the bounds of acceptability in science, which could be seen, this is something I've not seen put forward as much, but sort of an allusion to Unit 731 during World War II. And sort of the war crimes and atrocities that the Japanese army committed on prisoners of war, Chinese civilians, and dissenters as well.
Right.
And so there really is this depth to the material where what you get out of it really is based in part on what you bring into it.
Yeah, I mean, and I know we've talked about too about like the story is dense because it's critical, but also the world that it creates is dense. I mean, there's a scene, and the scene. Anyone who's listening has seen it, where the biker gang is going through they're going through the city. The way the buildings are animated, they're animated as if you're in a car, and there's shorter buildings, taller buildings. If you ever driven through a major city anywhere in the world, especially if you're on a bus or a train or just in a convertible at the top down, you'll see that kind of, it's not really a Doppler effect, but it's that effect where like larger objects are moving slower in the background than the foreground. And there's that scene where you just see going through the city, and there's the spotlights, and there's different buildings, and you see people and cars and trains moving, and it makes for a very dense world, which part of that is also because the setting of, and I can't believe we didn't get to this point, the setting of the story is technically in Neo Tokyo, which is a rebuilt version of Tokyo in Tokyo Bay. Because remember, Tokyo got destroyed 20 years before, so they decided to start rebuilding by reclaimed land in Tokyo Bay, which is not so far from science fiction, because in the 60s and 70s, there was architects and land developers in Japan proposing to do that as Tokyo was growing and becoming, the largest city in the world. Started as a small fishing village, before the Tokugawa shogunate, and now it's still I think it's still the largest city in the world when you go like population and like land size. I think because it's just, you see Tokyo from the air and it's just like a big chunk of that part of the island. It's nothing but sprawl. So there was concerns about economic environmental concerns in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s even, of, well, let's build these very dense housing units or these very dense city centers in Tokyo Bay, which was a profound influence on the movie, and that's where it takes place. So it's both dense visually, but it's also dense because they're in a very dense space. They don't have kind of they can't stretch their arms as much.
It's a lot of the filmmaking techniques that you see in like film noir, where the city is a labyrinth and the city is constricting you. And then just, I think, sort of an interesting point to end on is, it is this very Japanese film, but it does have a lot of American influence as well. I had joked, that it is a juvenile delinquency film, which is sort of my wheelhouse right now. But, it's about a group of bikers who are up to no good. It is kind of about the Wild One, but if the Wild One included body horror, and if Brando had psychic powers
and government experimentation,
But so it does sort of play on these American tropes that were sort of brought out through the occupation, and just like, I think part of the reason why it cracked through to the United States, maybe more than something like Bubblegum Crisis or, one of the other big OVAs of the 1980s, is it does have this sort of Americanness to it in sort of the main characters. Like it sort of is aware of film more broadly. They are hanging out at the like kind of local dive bar. Like there's a lot of trappings of American consumerism in the film as well.
Well, and I would even go further and say there's also maybe not only American but also British. I could see a direct influence, whether either on purpose or not, from something like A Clockwork Orange, even,
which is another juvenile delinquency film. I'm not the first person to say
which
that.
Is, whether it's the Kubrick film version or the book version by Burgess, you can see that influence of like, Clockwork Orange, they have the milk bar, they hang out. There's kind of that dive bar. There's like a lot of great animes, and I know that's not the topic of this, but like Cowboy Bebop, it pulled influences from everywhere else in a very Japanese style, took all these influences from everything else, tried to emulate these styles, and by putting it kind of through this cultural food processor, the meal that came out on the other side was wholly unique, and it wasn't even, it was uniquely Japanese, but it's also uniquely something else. And you see this continually in Japanese pop culture. There was a lot of, in the 70s, a lot of live action TV shows and movies. The composers and the people making music for these shows wanted to emulate a lot of the funk music you saw in like American exploitation films, and by trying to make their own versions of those type of soundtracks, created their own genre or their own subgenre of funk now. And you see that repeatedly with Japanese culture. Saying, you see someone, a musician or an artist, saying, "Oh, what they're doing over there in France or Korea or America is really cool. I'm going to try to make my own version." And then they take it, and then it becomes its own unique thing. Just for whatever reason, it does. And I think Akira is a great example of that, of taking influences from everywhere. It wasn't just American delinquents films. Again, I mentioned Matt all earlier in Pure Invention, and I spoke to him one time, and he talks about how with, especially with like science fiction and stuff, the Japanese not only had access to American science fiction, but they also had access to Soviet science fiction. The idea of a space elevator originally came from Soviet science fiction. So the Japanese were able to pull on all these threads, all these strings from all around the world, as well as their own culture, their own history, their own pop culture, pull upon these strings, mash them all up, and then you have something like Akira, which you can see elements from all over the world, elements from all over kind of a pop culture landscape, and that's reflected also in the film, because the film, surprisingly enough, for a Japanese film, there's a lot of implied multiculturalism in Neo Tokyo. When they're going through the city, you're seeing signs and advertisements for American products and Soviet products and Korean products, and even to the point where some of the characters, the main military character, it was my third or fourth watch through, I realized, oh, he's supposed to be Japanese, because he's presented almost like an American, like an African American military person. The way, his skin's a little bit darker, he has the mustache. When I picked up, I was like, oh, he's supposed to be a black man, because that's how it kind of is presented. So again, there's that implied multiculturalism, whether it was meant to be that way or not. And I think that comes from all these influences that Akira is pulling on.
All right, so of course we always like to end these episodes with a film recommendation and a book recommendation. Ryan, you've mentioned it a couple times already. I'll let you go ahead and start with your book recommendation.
All right, well, my book recommendation is called, I'm going to do the full title just because it's a fun title. Yeah. It's one of those titles where you read that, you're like, oh, well, I got to read that. But it's called Pure Invention: How Japan Made the Modern World by Matt Alt. It's a great book. He talks about, the cover itself has the Great Wave Kanagawa, Pac-Man, Hello Kitty, a warp pipe, and Godzilla on it. So if you like any of those things, pick it up.
I like all of those things.
But right, who doesn't? But Matt's thesis in this, and I know the author person. This is not a plug for him. This is, I really enjoy his book. So I call him Matt because we are friends. We worked together in the past. But his whole thesis is how through these different inventions, whether it's through video games, karaoke, these different things, Japan kind of invented the modern world, and now the whole world, for lack of a better word, is kind of global pop culture is Japanese pop culture in a sense. And so that's kind of his thesis, and I think he does a very great job in that book, and it's a great book. As for a movie recommendation, I when you mentioned this to me that I had to come up with a movie recommendation, I was trying to think something profound, something poignant. I recall when certain people, Robin Williams, when he was on Inside the Actor Studio, he was like, I want to come up with these very unique answers to the questions, and then when he's asked, he's like, I got nothing. I got nothing. And that's how I feel right now. I want to do something maybe obscure, esoteric, and no, I'm not doing that. My recommendation, if you want to see a film that is uniquely Japanese, that is and it doesn't shy away. It is a uniquely Japanese story in both setting and themes and tone, but yet it is endearing and it is beloved to the point where even my mother is in her 60s and she loves it. My Neighbor Totoro. Studio Ghibli, I'm a huge fan of Hayao Miyazaki and his work. I feel like that's a whole other episode to Miyazaki and his influence, influenced by Disney, makes his own studio, and now he's gone on to influence animators around the world through his work. And the beat moves, goes on.
Yeah, often called the Japanese Disney, which is,
yes.
Fine. Yeah, like
yeah, sure.
You can quibble, but
there's a
he's
few other.
Japan's Walt Disney.
Yeah, sure. And what I like about Miyazaki too, you see him in interviews, and he's kind of just a grumpy old man.
A very
he's
grumpy
not,
man.
Very grumpy man. Even when he was younger, he's just like a grumpy, irritable granddad,
Mhm.
and I think that makes him even more charming and endearing because he definitely has a sense of I am getting too old for this, and he keeps retiring and coming out of retirement to make more movies. So I love that kind of grumpy granddad. I'm retiring, to hell with you all, and then 2 years later, it's like I have an idea for a movie. So I can respect that. But My Neighbor Totoro, Totoro, I'm going to keep saying that wrong. My Neighbor Totoro, it's a great story. Like I said, it's very uniquely Japanese in both theme, tone, and setting, and yet it is beloved. And it's, again, for me, is up there with Akira and Cowboy Bebop. I think of those highly influential, highly unique. It's one of those where, like, again, with Akira, you might have to watch it twice to pick up on the story. But go in with open mind, sit down, let the visuals take you on a journey, and they will. And that can be said about a lot of Miyazaki films. But I think this movie is a great starting point before you get into more things like Spirited Away or Kiki's Delivery Service,
or one that we didn't mention, Nausicaa.
Nausicaa, the Valley of the Wind.
I think it's interesting because even though they're not super easy to get a hold of, because the streaming rights kind of switch around, the Ghibli movies are in theaters every so often. Like it's like Ghibli Fest, where you can go see like Porco Rosso or something in the movie theater one weekend.
Or The Cat Returns or The Wind Rises, some of the more obscure.
But I do think that, because I had asked earlier, so Akira was sort of the gateway for a lot of us. I do think that the Ghibli movies, as they become more accessible, Spirited Away won an Oscar in 2002, which was seen as sort of a huge, not that it needed it, but sort of a validating moment for anime in the West as sort of a critical enterprise. I think a lot of people are maybe getting into it through that, which is good because that's certainly a lot more approachable for a younger audience than something like this. But I do think that that's probably sort of where the pipeline starts now.
Right. Well, and it's one of those things too, where, like, if you're gonna, I'll give a great example of, the first time I ever played golf as a child was at the Old Course of St. Andrews on a choir trip. The first time, I mean, I've tried playing golf before. Once you played on the old course, like that's where people like try to get to, and that's kind of where I started. So I peaked early, I guess you could say. But Studio Ghibli is kind of the same thing. If it's going to be the only anime you ever watch, if you watch a Studio Ghibli film, you're not going to go wrong.
Right.
It's kind of like if you're going to eat, if you only have one time to go to the fanciest restaurant, go to the fancy restaurant and order the most expensive thing, and you're not going to be disappointed. Ghibli's kind of like that. It's like if you're going to start, you're starting with the filet mignon of anime movies for a lot of people. I know for me, my entrance into kind of the older adult anime or I shouldn't say adult, I should say mature anime or anime with the mature themes was Princess Mononoke. That was the first time where I'm like, oh, you can do that in animation, and of course that led to, Akira and high school and stuff like that. So yeah, really any Studio Ghibli film I will recommend, but I think My Neighbor Totoro is going to be kind of that, a good entry point of kind of magical realism and also just a very fun slice of life story at the end of the day. It's really a slice of life story with a magical cat who may or may not represent death. But that's a whole other. I'll let you watch and let you decide.
So my recommendations, I'm going to go with Jonathan Clements' Anime: A History. There is a decent amount of literature out there, history out there, but his work, I believe it's in its second or third edition now. He really, I pulled a lot from him this episode. He just really does the technological angle. He does a lot of the critical angle. He has an artist's eye and a historian's mind. So I do think that whatever area of this history that you're the most interested in, he does write very expertly on it. He writes very deftly on it. And history books don't always get multiple editions unless they are, contributing a lot. And so this first one was published in 2013. It's already been reissued. So that tells you that he does good work and a lot of people are in on it. Since we're going with anime recommendations, I'll say if you watch this movie and you like it and you want more of the sort of science fiction horror angle, Serial Experiments Lane is a series that sort of is similar in tone and style. It's smaller story. It's not about national global catastrophe, but it is a psychological horror kind of a show. But then the one that really, really sold me, and to sort of combat what you said, if the first movie you see is The Godfather, you're going to compare every movie you watch after that to The Godfather.
Right.
Don't watch 80 for Brady after watching The Godfather. But my favorite anime series, certainly, we've mentioned it here and there. We could do a whole series on it. Is Cowboy Bebop. To my mind, the single greatest anime series. It also has one OVA film as well.
And an amazing soundtrack.
Amazing soundtrack. If you're into music, it is a science fiction Western. If you're familiar with Firefly, if you're familiar with The Mandalorian or Book of Boba Fett, all of these things certainly owe a great deal to Cowboy Bebop. One of the most visually gripping, just as we talked about, a lot of the style and technique in Akira. Cowboy Bebop did experiment with a lot of computer animation. Just like Evangelion, it was funded. Basically, they designed the toys and they said, come up with a show about these toys. And the toy spaceships are probably the least interesting part of the show.
Right.
There's some good space shootouts, but really it's this character-driven, just brilliant. All the Western tropes are there. I love a good Western. I rewatch it every so often. I assembled my collection of the Cowboy Bebop DVDs as they were released in the United States. I would go to the mall and buy the new one every time it was out. And so I made sure to have those in my possession as soon as possible, and I haven't let them go since.
I think it was about 10 years ago, 2014, when they re-released the box set. That was when I finally bought it. I was like, I need to get this for posterity's sake. And yeah, it's the best. I mean, I know I'm at the right age where like Cowboy Bebop, Gundam Wing, and Sailor Moon were kind of like my introduction to anime on Cartoon Network. But once you watch Cowboy Bebop, it's like it's hard to go back to watching stuff made for even stuff that's made for kids. Like Cowboy Bebop is just like, and it's been hard to find series and now where I'm like, I was compared to Cowboy Bebop. I'm like, oh, no, I'm not feeling this, but I'll go back and watch Cowboy Bebop. I do the same thing with Mad Men. Mad Men's kind of like my example of the TV show, and all other all other dramas are compared to that, and it's not fair to those other shows, but it is kind of it's one of those things where it's so good you can't help but comparing everything else you watched to that. And I think Cowboy Bebop's up there, Akira's up there, My Neighbor Totoro, and just talking about anime, and we can get into other like live action Godfather or whatever.
Yeah, I have the DVDs, and very rarely do I buy the same thing on multiple formats. But the Blu-ray Cowboy Bebops, the fact that I didn't pull the trigger already, I think speaks more to my laziness to take my credit card out than anything else. But
right. Well, and I will say this too for people who are like maybe they're trying to get into anime or they don't know where to start. The beauty of Cowboy Bebop, I think, is one of the few series where the dub is just as good as the sub.
Yes.
To the point where even the Japanese producers and directors and voice actors think the American version is superior to the original Japanese, which is, it's not controversial to say for that, but it is controversial when you talk about other animes and sub versus dub and the whole online debate in the early 2000s about that. Cowboy Bebop is one of those universally accepted where the dub version is just as good, if not better, than the sub version.
And I think that marked a turning point. We are going to wrap up here, or not. But that did mark a turning point where, as we talked about, early dubs were sort of just, get this out the door as cheap as possible. I think Cowboy Bebop showed the importance of being able to have a dub that did not detract from the quality of the work that existed elsewhere. Akira has a good dub. It's had a couple different ones, but the one that was released, the second one that was released in the United States, I believe, is the one that is still used to this day.
And I believe that's the one that's like on Hulu and some of the other streaming services and stuff. It's the second run dub.
But yeah, I could talk easily another hour, 2 hours just on Cowboy Bebop.
Oh.
I think we're going to call it quits for tonight. I do think we have a lot of great branching paths to go from this episode. We do have a few other episodes picked out and already in the hopper ready to go. The more I dive into animation history, the more I think, gosh, I really want to just talk a lot about animation history. So this is the History on Film podcast, but now it's maybe the History on Celluloid podcast or History on Paper podcast. Well, I guess all history is history on paper. But Ryan, this was so much fun.
It was my pleasure. I mean, these are the kind of conversations in college we'd have just for fun. So
yeah, in every reality you and I have done an Akira podcast. This is just the one where we have academic credentials, included as well. This was bound to happen. This was written in the stars.
Right. This is in Marvel Comics what they call the Nexus event. This is one of those things that is a fixed point in time in all reality.
So normally this is the part where I would say goodbye, see you next time. Instead, I'm just going to say, see you, Space Cowboy.
"愛してたと嘆くにはあまりにも時は過ぎてしまった」「まだ心のほころびを癒せぬまま風が吹いてる」「乾いた瞳で誰か泣いてくれ」The real folk blues 本当の悲しみが知りたいだけ泥の川に浸かった人生も悪くはない一度きりで終わるなら
Jack and Paul,